It's Thursday, the 8th of December, and this is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Robin Walker, Labour peer and Shadow Minister Jenny Chapman, former First Minister of Northern Ireland Arlene Foster, and columnist George Monbiot. So, what's going on today?
If the union leaders to continue to be unreasonable, then it is my duty to take action to protect the lives and livelihoods of the British public.
Workers are angry, the public's frustrated, the government says it's had enough. But are tougher laws the right way to get people back to work? The first new coal mine for 30 years in Whitehaven in Cumbria gets the go-ahead from the government. Climate campaigners do not dig it, but some local people really do.
Well, I think you just have to look up and down King Street to see that needs a bit of investment, doesn't it?
All the empty shops, and it used to be a really thriving place.
Meanwhile, a blood-curdling warning about the threat to nature from the boss of the UN.
Humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. We are treating nature like a toilet.
And is this zinger the conclusive proof that Keir Starmer is much more ruthless than you first thought?
His backbenchers threatened him. And as always, the blancmange Prime Minister wobbled.
And we'll talk about people's favourite desserts later on. But first of all, we're going to have a little bit of respite from all of that, and we're going to listen to some of The Nutcracker by Tchaikovsky. Now, that's not because our regular teacher, Joe Coburn, is off and I'm the supply teacher and we're watching a video today. It's because the Ukrainian culture minister has written a piece in The Guardian where he says that arts institutions in Ukraine's allies should pause performances by Russian composers like Tchaikovsky, and that would keep Vladimir Putin on his toes. Little ballet reference there. So, basically, it's a cultural boycott he's proposing. Jenny, will you be ripping up your tickets for The Nutcracker?
Well, I think I could actually personally live without Tchaikovsky probably for the rest of my life, but that might say more about me and my lack of cultural education. But, I mean, there is a serious point here about sporting events and about culture, and the Labour Party feels that actually we should be excluding Russia from significant sporting events because the fact is that Putin, glorifies in these moments and uses them to enhance his standing in Russia and on the world stage, and we should not be allowing them that opportunity. Sad as it is for those who would like to compete, sometimes, you do need to take these battles into those arenas too.
But Robin, does it really make a difference?
I don't think banning Tchaikovsky would. I mean, I think there's a question about what you can do which has leverage on the Russian regime, in the current Russian regime. I think it's absolutely fair enough to look at things that do that. I think we've got to remember that some of the culture from previous Russian regimes, I think, has nothing to do with that. And so in that respect, I think it will probably be going too far to say that we should be boycotting Tchaikovsky. I have a 4-year-old daughter who's very passionate about ballet. And
so you're going? Are you going?
She's only ever seen it on YouTube so far. Yeah. But actually, I think it's good to have that breadth of culture available to children and young and old alike. I do think, though, there's a serious point about how we can make sure that Russia feels its international isolation, and it's absolutely right that we should be pushing on sanctions. We should be looking at modern-day sporting events and other fora in which we should absolutely be making sure they feel the pressure.
But Arlene, I mean, where would this stop, though? I mean, what if you're planning to read War and Peace over the Christmas holidays? Like, should we not be doing that?
Well,
that's what you're getting at.
I don't agree with cutting out Russian culture from society. I mean, I think that would be wrong. And I think it's wrong not only for us here in the UK, but for all of those people who live in Russia under this regime. I've always said it's the ordinary people of Russia who are suffering. It's the ordinary people of Ukraine who are suffering. And our answer should not be, we're going to cut off your culture. I think there are other ways in which we need to, as you say, Robin, isolate the Russian regime, but cutting off culture is not the way.
George, I reckon you've probably done a few boycotts in your life. Do they actually work? And if you think back to something that you didn't do a few years ago, did it make any difference?
Well, some economic boycotts can work, but cultural boycotts, I mean, it's too ridiculous. Look, our argument is with Putin, it's with his illegal war of aggression. It's not with Tchaikovsky, it is not with Tolstoy. And you demean and devalue the crucial cause of Ukrainian sovereignty by spreading the net in this way. I mean, it always gets ridiculous. You know, you think of the renaming of German shepherds as Alsatians in the First World War, or in the Second World War in the US, they started calling sauerkraut liberty cabbage. And check this, German measles, liberty measles. Yeah. Whoa, I got liberty measles, hooray!
Yeah. I mean, we've all been seeing kind of the funny side of this, and I'm as much to blame for that too. But there is a serious point, which is that the Ukrainian culture minister is making, is that Putin is trying to erase Ukrainian culture in Russia. So actually, this is a battlefield now. It's not just jokes about really.
But you don't go down, you don't go lower then. If somebody is going low and attacking your culture, you don't say, well, in retaliation, I'm going to cut off your culture. I think that is the wrong way to go, and we should be bigger than that. But there are other ways in which we can isolate Putin, and we should be certainly looking at that. And we should still be talking about the war in Ukraine, because sometimes I think people get a bit frustrated and fed up listening about the war in Ukraine. The fact is, it's still going on. And it needs to be at the forefront of everybody's minds, particularly at this time of the year when it's so very cold.
Yeah, I feel I should maybe look at some Ukrainian ballets on YouTube. Maybe your daughter can send me some links. Right, OK, let's look at the front pages of today's papers, and they're all dominated by the strikes, because it looks like there will be at least one strike in a sector of the economy every day until Christmas. Let's see how the papers have been treating this. First of all, we can look at the Daily Mail. They're saying it's beginning to look a lot like an Xmas general strike. In other words, all these strikes are kind of merging into one. The Times is focusing on a new strike that we heard about last night, which is Border Force staff at Britain's airports who are not going to go to work around about Christmas, which could affect people who are trying to get away on a break or going to see their families. And the Daily Telegraph has gone with the angle about the military being asked to come in and fill the gaps, and some of the military personnel not being happy because it means that they miss their Christmases. But then The Sun, their political editor Harry Cole has zoomed in on the government response with this headline saying PM will ban ambulance drivers and firefighters from striking under, quote, tough new laws. That's a reference to this idea that's been around for a while, that you could put in law kind of minimum levels of service that have to be provided, and people on strike would not be able to go below that level. And it looks like the government is thinking about extending that to some other places. Previously, they'd only talked about doing that in the transport sector. Now, Robin, there are so many strikes. The list is actually quite extraordinary when you see it all written down in one place. The idea of legislating for minimum levels of service, isn't that kind of like reinforcing the stable door after all the horses have bolted?
Well, I think, first of all, no one wants to see these strikes go ahead. I think it's important that there are negotiations and there are attempts to reach agreement on these things. I think to a large extent, though, the government has engaged on many of the issues that the unions are raising. If I look at my area as chairman of the Education Select Committee, we had a very clear demand for the unions that £2 billion was needed next year and the year after for the sector. That has now been provided as a result of the autumn statement, and yet they're still balloting to strike. I think in those circumstances, it's absolutely right for the government to look at what is the minimum service that needs to be provided. How do we make sure that children who have missed out on so much as a result of the COVID lockdowns don't miss out further on their vital education? You can only be educated once. So in that space, I do think it is worth exploring, and I questioned the Secretary of State yesterday on contingency measures that the government today. I don't think it necessarily requires new legislation in that space. But I think when we're talking about public safety, of course it is the case that the police and the armed forces aren't able to strike. It always has been and has been in law for a long time. I don't think it's unreasonable actually to look at what may be required to keep vital services functioning over this period. I hope it won't be necessary, because I hope these things can be resolved through negotiation. And I would always urge colleagues in government to engage first and seek to avoid strikes.
You bring up the teachers. Teachers in Scotland are on strike today. You mentioned the ballot for teachers elsewhere. Do you think when the government's looking at this idea of legislation for minimum service levels, schools should be in there too? It shouldn't just be transport, ambulances, firefighters? firefighters?
Well, I think we need to look at how we keep schools open. I think it's absolutely vital. It's something my predecessor as chair of the Select Committee sort of wanted to make sure that there were tougher laws against schools ever being closed again after the lessons of what we saw during COVID. I think he had a very good point in that. And even having been on the receiving end of it as a minister, I felt he had a fair point.
Just to be clear, you would advise ministers consider...
I don't think legislation is necessarily the solution in this. I think proper contingency planning, working with schools to make sure that they can have the core staff in place to enable children to be able to continue to come in is probably sufficient in that space. But of course, what we do need to make sure is recognise what are vital public services and how can we keep them going.
OK. George?
Well, this is a profoundly illiberal government. It's already introduced the most repressive anti-protest laws of the modern era, and now it wants severely to curtail the right to strike. Yeah, there are always two sides in an industrial dispute, and one side has been winning its class war for years and years now, and that is the bosses, capital, the big corporations, and indeed the government, crushing public services and crushing terms and conditions for workers within public services. And if you want to resolve industrial action, and if you want to ensure that people don't go on strike, you give them decent wages and decent terms and conditions. And what we've seen is this government seeming quite deliberately to be stoking industrial action, as we've seen with the railways. It introduced the idea of driver-only trains at the last minute, almost as if it were trying to spike any resolution of that action. It thrives on chaos, it thrives on dysfunction, it wants to be seen performatively to be beating up its class enemies. And while that might play well with some of its base and some of its right-wing backbenchers, it's a disaster for the country.
Robin, how do you reply to that claim?
I simply don't recognise that picture. If we look at public sector workers, they tend to be better paid than their equivalents in the private sector. We have terms and conditions which are negotiated with the unions. I was talking only yesterday to representatives of the National Education Union about the wellbeing strategy which the Department of Education have put in place in consultation with them. So Robin, I think that's a very misleading picture that's being painted, particularly when it comes to
how do you
public
explain
services.
the Transport Secretary's refusal to answer the question of whether they deliberately introduced this issue of driver-only trains in order to derail, so to speak,
driver-only trains have
the
been something which has been in technology over a very long period of time. They came into place on the DLR under the last Labour government.
So why was it thrown in at the last moment?
I don't think it was. I think this is something which has been a very long time coming in the transport sector. I think in that case you're talking about something which is entirely different, in that you're talking about workers who are working for private sector companies who are negotiating with their employers.
They derailed the negotiations which would have brought this industrial action to an end.
I'm not cited on that detail, but what I would say is that I think government needs to negotiate.
Right, you two are helping the programme's timetable slipping. So, Jenny, if these minimum service levels are legislated for, would the Labour government unwrap them on the first day in office?
Well, they're not going to do anything to help this situation. The government's incompetent. It has deliberately caused this problem. Knowingly, over the summer, the then Transport Secretary decided...
Well, no, the negotiations are between the train companies and the staff.
He decided it was really good politics for the Tory party to make this situation worse. He deliberately went out and aggravated it to get to where we are now. Now we've got to where we are. The new Transport Secretary admitted yesterday morning that actually this legislation isn't going to do anything to solve the problems that we're facing now that are causing massive disruption and heartache for a lot of families who really wanted to be together this Christmas.
So that's a critique of the government and the current situation.
The situation is you've got to negotiate. It's wrong that the Health Secretary didn't sit down with the nurses' unions on day one and say, where do we go from here? You know, the strikes are a symptom of something that's been going very badly wrong for many, many years. And this most recent incarnation of the Tory party is probably the most incompetent and provocative we've had, and they have made it worse. You are never going to get
Robin
anywhere...
is obviously shaking his head at that.
Robin's had a lot to say, but actually, I think in his heart of hearts, Robin knows this government is not functioning and is making this worse. And we're not going to get any solution to this by this kind of grandstanding, we're going to pass a law. Has he not noticed the shortages that there already are in the health service? the low numbers of people coming in to become teachers. You know, what is going to happen if you put these kind of draconian rules in place? You're going to make that worse as well. The services are going to suffer, and in the end, it'll be kids and people who need treatment in our hospitals that pay the price for this.
So Labour have said they would repeal some previous trade union legislation introduced by the government, but you're not saying what you would do with this minimum.
It doesn't work.
Right.
You know, you remember that under a Labour government for 13 years, we didn't have these strikes. It just didn't happen. Because
we didn't have inflation at 11%.
No, but inflation at 11% is not caused by postmen getting a pay rise, is it? You know, we didn't have this. And the reason we didn't, and it's not that there weren't problems, it's not that those trade unions thought that the Blair government was great at every step of the way. Believe me, they did not. There were issues. But they've talked about it. There was negotiation. You had a government that saw it as its job to keep these services going and to keep the schools open and to keep people getting treated in the hospitals.
What we saw the last time we saw these kinds of inflationary pressures in the 1970s is a Conservative government that had difficulties with strikes, and then a Labour government that had much greater difficulties with strikes.
Sake.
So people need to realise that the kind of pressures that we're seeing would not necessarily go away, vanish magically overnight under a Labour government. In many respects, they might intensify.
But
so it is important that government has the tools at its disposal to keep public services running.
You know that. I know you know this. Your party has caused this situation. Look at where mortgage rates are. Look at the cost of living. Look at what's happened to pay.
OK, well, you know what? Let's get Arlene to look at that, because you're out of office now. You also had to deal with some disputes when you were in office. Now
Just a few.
Yeah, now you've got, well, I was going to say particularly Labour disputes, and there's plenty of others as well.
Yeah.
Now that you've got a bit more of a distance from all of this and a bit more of a bird's eye view, I mean, what's the answer?
It's interesting to hear George talk about grandstanding from the government. I see grandstanding from both sides, actually, because Mick Lynch, for example, promised that there wouldn't be, from the RMT, that they would not interfere with Christmas. And now we're reading all of these stories about people who can't be with their family at Christmas. And don't forget, there are many families that are separated, children living with their mums, they're going to see their dads at Christmas and what have you. That's not going to happen now because this has all come about. So, you know, there's a real imperative to sort this out for ordinary people, actually. And instead of the grandstanding on both sides, and that is what I'm saying from both sides, there's a real need to get down and get it sorted.
And George, you said there's two sides in this. There's the bosses and the capitalists, and then there's the poor workers. Isn't there a third side, which is actually the people that need to fly off to see their family or get the train to work? Don't they have rights to do that too?
Well, they do, and we've all got rights to good services, but our public services have been undermined systematically now for a very long time, well, for 12 years to be precise, and they are suffering grievously, and the workers are suffering on those services, customers...
People aren't suffering a bad train service because of cuts. They're suffering a bad train service because the trains aren't running because of the strike.
No, actually, people are suffering a bad train service.
In addition to that,
yes.
then, okay.
And part of what the strike is about the terms and conditions which affect both the workers and the customers on the train services, where, you know, we have this privatised service, money is being sucked out of it, we're not seeing the investment we need to be seeing, we're seeing terms and conditions for workers cut at the same time as terms and conditions for customers are cut.
But I do think there's a need for reform in all institutions, and I think that's part of the difficulty here. When you have some unions who are saying, no, we're not going to have any reform, then the difficulty with that is you're going to have to keep putting more and more government money in to have a service, and that's just not efficient, and it's not the right way to run things either. So I think this idea from unions, some unions, not all, some unions, that there can't be any reform and there can't be any redundancies, and we just need more money, is not going to land either. They're not going to land either.
The starting point would be that you nationalise the service and you make it a service which actually works for the people of this country rather than for a few foreign corporations who are currently creaming off the market.
Okay, so the services we're talking about are already nationalised. We're talking about strikes affecting. So there's clearly nationalisation is not the solution to this challenge.
Are you talking about the NHS?
When you're talking about health, when you're talking about other areas, these are nationalised.
Right, so you're talking about nationalisation, you're taking us back to the 70s. They're also going a bit back to the future in Whitehaven in Cumbria, because they're going to get their first new coal mine in more than 3 decades. Now, it's not a coal mine to dig coal out the ground to then put in a power station or someone's fire. It's what's called coking coal, so it's to use in the metals industry. And it's been incredibly controversial because Michael Gove finally approved it last night as the Levelling Up Secretary. He's kind of like the final bit of the planning process, and this decision had been delayed loads and loads and loads of times. You can see it's made the front page of The Guardian. The way they described it is that's Michael Gove ignoring climate warnings to approve this first coal mine in 30 years. George, what do you reckon?
It's so crazy. I mean, here we are, just come out of the climate summit in Egypt, which was a disaster because it did not lead to leaving fossil fuels in the ground, which is the one thing we have to do. This coal mine is providing coking coal for the steel industry, which does not want it. We have British Steel, we have individual steel manufacturers saying there's going to be no market for this here because it's high sulphur, and in fact, steel manufacturers are now moving over to electric arc, which doesn't require coal burning at all. On the jobs issue, well, you know, if you want to create jobs, get our homes insulated. There's a desperate need for that, and I'm sure many people on this cold day are feeling it right now. You know, we could generate huge amounts of jobs because insulation is high labour, low capital, whereas this coal mining is high capital, low labour. You know, it won't employ many people. In fact, it probably won't employ anyone at all because by the time it's ready to start producing coal, it will be a stranded asset. So here's the government, yet again, playing to the worst instincts and the worst parts of its backbenches, the kind of people who brought us Brexit, thanks for that, guys, now bringing us the ripping up of our climate commitments and vast amounts of money, of spoil heaps, of wastage, of blight, just to produce something which probably isn't going anywhere anyway.
Well, on the jobs picture, it's perceived very differently, as you might imagine, by the Conservative leader of the local borough council, who is David Moore.
Not a single green job has been created yet that I'm aware of here in Copeland. But this is going to create us 500 jobs almost immediately, 1,500 in the supply chain. And I think people have to understand that mining is very different now. So the type of skills they're looking for is those young people out there that are now playing on their PlayStations and Xboxes. Those are the type of skills you need to drive a mining machine today. So it's about the opportunities for our young people as well as the wider community.
So, Robin, just explain to us how this is consistent with the UK's climate change goals.
Well, I think crucially we have exited coal for power completely, and we are one of the leading countries in Europe when it comes to that, unlike countries like Germany, which are importing coal from Poland, some of the dirtiest coal in Europe, and burning it
but
to
this
keep their
coal
power
will
going.
still be burnt.
This coal will be used as part of the steelmaking process, and the alternative to that, and I agree with George, but in the long run, we want all our steelmaking process to move towards arc furnaces or possibly the use of hydrogen as well. I think there are ways of doing this in the future. But in the short term, the alternative to that is importing coal from the other side of the world, bringing it in from other countries, which will mean shipping it at enormous environmental cost as well as financial cost,
85%
and
of this coal is going to be for export.
making our steel industry fundamentally less competitive. If we do that, we will be importing the steel from China. We will be importing it from third countries,
I see. So
which has an enormous environmental footprint.
So this is net zero. This coal is net zero because we're going to send it to other countries to burn.
No, this coal can reduce the overall environmental footprint of our steel industry by not relying on more expensive and more environmentally expensive imports from elsewhere.
This coal is going to be exported, Robin. You're just talking rubbish. This coal is not for the domestic market. Even in the plans for this mine, 83% of the coal is going to be exported.
But there is demand
so even
for
if there were
the
any basis for this argument you're making at all, which there isn't, because the transport aspect of coal is tiny by comparison to the fossil fuels produced by burning it. Even if there were, it is still false because this coal is for export. Why are you telling us this rubbish?
The coal will be burnt whether or not we produce it or whether other countries produce it. What it means is that the European market can actually rely on this rather than shipping the stuff from around the world.
Well, no one
there
in
is
Europe
a huge
wants
environmental
it either.
footprint.
It's too high sulphur for Europe. You can't sell it in Europe. It's going to go outside
and the reality
of Europe.
of the approach which is being suggested by people like George is that it will result in more steel being imported from higher polluting countries on the far side of the world. I don't think that's the solution. I think we need to maintain our domestic steel industry, and we absolutely need to incentivise it to move towards greener technologies over time. But in the meantime, I do think this is a sensible.
It's getting very, very violent imagery there. Jenny, would a Labour government, you can see the theme to my questions to you,
yes, thank you very much.
Shut down this coal mine?
I don't think the coal mine will be up and running and viable by the time of the next general election. I don't think anybody is claiming that. If I thought, right, I come from the northeast of England, right? So communities around me, it's steel, it's coal. I get this. If I thought, and I agree with what George has said, obviously, about climate, but if I honestly thought that this was the solution for the economy of Whitehaven and Cumbria, and this was going to bring 500 really good, well-paid jobs to that community, I would have to really look at my conscience over this. but I just don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Because if you look at what's happening in steel and any other industry, the need for coal is going down and down and down. So why aren't we saying to Cumbria, you can have your modular reactor, so we're reinvesting in nuclear for them. Why aren't we saying we want to invest in hydrogen, in battery, energy storage? Why aren't we investing in those jobs? Because that council leader, he's welcoming that mine because he's got one job, and that's to look after that community. And he says, not a single green job. Right, so I want to be able to say to him, you're not going to get these green jobs in this sort of airy-fairy, 10 years' time, we might find you some lovely jobs in wind power. We need to be able to say to him, you're going to get these jobs in this community, it's going to employ this people. We're going to work with your universities and your colleges and your schools to make sure your local population are the people who are going to get the benefit of these jobs. And you need to work together and get that plan delivered. Because this mine, this is not going to be the solution for West Cumbria. I don't think anybody believes it is. And if I thought it was, I might take a different view of this, but those jobs are not what they're being sold as today.
So if it's not up and running by the next time there's a Labour government, then you stop it being built? Or
what will be there in 2 years' time? I don't think anyone's saying they're going to be taking coal out the ground. There's going to be a market for it. There's going to be hundreds of jobs dependent on that activity. If that was the situation, obviously we'd have to look at it. But that's not what anyone's claiming.
But the reason why Labour used to represent these communities and now they don't any longer and Conservatives are being elected there is because Labour didn't deliver those jobs.
Because there was a promise of levelling up from the Tory party. Where is it? Where are those bus routes? Where's those train services?
Well, you know what? Let's park that, if you pardon the bus
I live in the North East, and I know exactly what was said in that election, and I know exactly what the Labour Party was offering at the time as well.
Let's press pause on that discussion, because I want to keep it focused on the environment and green issues, because if you loved COP27, as George was referring to the climate change conference a minute ago, you're going to love COP15, which is happening in Canada right now, and it's kind of like the little brother or sister or, I don't know, shorter twin of the climate change conference, and it's about biodiversity. And it got started yesterday with this quite worrying warning from the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres.
Ecosystems have become playthings of profit. With our bottomless appetite for unchecked and unequal economic growth, humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. We are treating nature like a toilet, and ultimately we are committing suicide by proxy.
Right, some very powerful images. Let's speak now to our climate change editor, Justin Rowlatt, who joins us down the line. Hi, Justin.
Hiya.
Biodiversity, to me, it's a bit of a jargon word. What actually is it, and how does it fit into just the whole kind of climate crisis thing?
I'm not sure that I buy that biodiversity is so complicated. Biodiversity just means the range of species on Earth, be they animals, plants, fungi, microorganisms, bacteria. It's life on Earth. It's as simple as that. It really isn't very complicated. There is a crisis in biodiversity. We know that. You can see the decline of wild populations of vertebrate animals, for example, down almost 70% since 1970. So catastrophic decline. The UN estimates about 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Scientists look at the pattern of extinction and say this is comparable, if not even faster, than some of the great extinction events that happened in our distant evolutionary past, some of which saw 90% of all species on Earth being wiped out. So the fear is we face another, like if climate change wasn't worrying enough, we face another terrible crisis on Earth, which is a crisis of biodiversity. Why is it important? Because the variety of species on Earth, the web of life, if you like, supports everything on Earth. All life on Earth is supported by other life on Earth. We lose that. We lose everything. We lose the clean air, clean water. We lose, what it is to have a living Earth. So it could not be more important. It really couldn't.
Justin, thank you very much for telling me off. I'm going to compliment your very on-brand green kitchen tiles in return.
We haven't got the central... I just want to explain. I'm wearing a fleece because we haven't turned our heating on. In true, living the story fashion, we still haven't got our heating on. So it's a little bit chilly in our house.
Very Newsnight circa 2008. In terms of trade-offs and action that's required, I mean, what should we as citizens be doing less of or more of to help solve the biodiversity crisis?
What should we be doing as citizens? We should be more careful about what we buy and where it comes from. But I mean, what is happening in in Montreal is an attempt to get the nations of the world, the countries of the world together. 196 countries are represented. I mean, we talk down these these big international meetings, but they are quite extraordinary examples of kind of humanity coming together to solve these really tricky problems. They aren't always as ambitious as we hope. That was certainly true of COP27, but they are like a step in the right direction. We really shouldn't undermine them. It's an extraordinary thing that's happening. So 196 countries coming together to try and agree a series of targets. It's much more complicated than climate change, which is complicated enough. They've got 4 key goals and then a series of, I think it's 23 separate targets. But the bottom line is this: what they're trying to do is halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030, which is hugely ambitious. There's a new phrase, a bit like net zero. They talk about nature positive, halting the loss and beginning the reversal of the loss of biodiversity. So that's the buzzword, nature positive. We want the world to be nature positive. How are they going to do that? Well, they're talking about protected areas, so increasing 30% of land and sea protected by 2030. Very ambitious. But some optimism that will be achieved. And then there'll be targets to prevent extinctions, to support wildlife populations around the world, restore habitat, that kind of thing. And they're all an effort to kind of cut subsidies that are damaging for nature, tackle drivers of biodiversity loss like deforestation and pollution. You get the impression, I could go on.
Yes.
And then there'll be a big resource, a big finance discussion, which there always is. How is the developed world going to help the developing world? Which are the kind of, if you like, the remaining biodiversity superpowers, if you like? How do they get the resources they need to protect these areas and support biodiversity? Huge, complex negotiations. But look, there is some optimism that we may come to an agreement. There's a kind of constellation of forces, unique moment that means that it might actually be a really significant decision coming out of Montreal.
Justin, thank you very much, and thank you to your scarf as well. Arlene, I mean, as a politician, you can probably get people to care about green jobs. It must be quite hard to get people to care about plants and animals in countries they might never go to.
Well, you know what, I'm going to agree with you and not agree with Justin. I think biodiversity is a word that's not really understood by children, by young people, the importance of it, the need to have biodiversity in nature. And therefore, I think we do need to break down some of our language sometimes, because we're talking here in a studio, we know what biodiversity is, but it's about time that we try to help other people understand that. And for me, it's about getting out into nature to understanding why it's important to have all of those different species, and indeed planting more trees. So if I can go back to something which I really think was a fabulous initiative, the Queen's Green Canopy, encouraging people to plant more trees. So it's local actions for me in biodiversity. That's what's important. And I think organisations and leadership that was given by the royal family, and indeed by uniformed organisations like the Guides and Scouts, getting out into nature, getting into understanding it is really, really important.
Yeah, George, I mean, we love the natural world in this country, but have you been able to link that to a challenge called biodiversity loss?
There's a real disconnect, a real failure. I mean, if you look at National Trust, RSPB, Wildlife Trust, they've got 8 million members between them, and yet this is one of the most nature-depleted countries on Earth. On paper, we've got 28% of our land protected, but a scientific study shows that only 5% of it reaches the international standard of protected areas. At sea, you've got these vast marine protected areas, but they're just lines on a map, and trawlers can go straight through and rip them all apart. And so we like to tell ourselves that we're a nation of nature lovers, and we like to tick all the boxes, but actually when it comes to it, we are just not protecting our own wildlife and our own ecosystems. And we can't do this by ourselves. It is important to do all the things that Arlene is talking about, but those are really tiny by comparison to what governments can and should be doing. They should be making our protected areas genuine protected areas, rewilding them, restoring nature on a massive scale, which not only would prevent the 6th great extinction, but also draw down much of the carbon dioxide that's already been released into the atmosphere. And we're going to do that, we're going to need to do that as well.
Robin, there seems to have been a bit of toing and froing within the government about this idea of farmers conserving the natural world. Is the government doing enough, or have they kind of put all the focus on climate change and ignored this bit?
No, I think this is an important priority for the government. I think we have targets in law to reduce nature depletion and start improving the recovery of nature. I think that is an important start. But actually, I don't disagree with George in terms of thinking we can go further, particularly on marine protected zones. I think it's important that we do that. It's important we look at recovering, for instance, peatlands, which both in England and Northern Ireland, there are opportunities to do that, which are huge carbon source. I also think when it comes to farming policy, there's always a difficult balance to strike between incentivising food production and looking at food security, which particularly in the current environment is important, but also in protecting the environment. And I've been lobbying ministers on behalf of my local wildlife trust to talk more about the ELM scheme to make sure that we have an incentive to provide hedgerows, which are a really valuable natural habitat. Ministers are listening, and I hope they are acting. I'm not responsible for policy in that space, but I think it is really important. I think the other part, and where I'd agree with Arlene, is I think biodiversity can seem quite a sort of weird scientific term. Children do understand nature and they want to engage in nature. And one of the great things we've seen in our schools over the last 20 years has been the emergence of the forest schools movement and getting children outside, engaging with that. One of the things I was really pleased to do whilst I was at the Department for Education was approve a new GCSE in natural history. I think that fills a really important gap between that primary school stage and where we have A-level environmental studies and so on and so forth. It allows children to continue to engage with nature, take part in field studies and get a better understanding of biodiversity and the importance of that. So this is an important agenda. It's one that we need to lean into internationally, and I think the UK can actually be a force for good in this respect.
One of my favourite memories of working on the Daily Politics, the predecessor of this programme, was doing a quiz with Liz Truss when she was Environment Secretary about identifying various leaves. She got every single one right.
I remember that.
So she did have some skills. Right, OK, let's talk about something that's going on in the Labour Party. Labour Party. Yeah, don't bring up that lettuce again. There was no brassicas in that quiz. Right, is the lettuce a brassica?
No, it's not.
OK,
no.
Thank you. Right, OK. Let's talk about something that's going on in the Labour Party at the moment. They're selecting their candidates that we'll all be kind of looking at in the next election and deciding whether to vote for them or not. But there have been some complaints from some on the left that they are being excluded from that process or not being treated very fairly. And I think that's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it affects who you're presented with at the ballot box at the next election. But also some people are saying it reveals something about Keir Starmer's leadership. Somebody who cares about this is Andrew Fisher, who was policy chief for the previous Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and he's here now. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
Right, what is your concern about what's going on in this process? And just make it easy for us outsiders to understand, if you could.
Sure. So right across the party, as you said, local parties are supposed to be selecting their candidates. But what we found right across the country is that candidates who are perceived to be on the left are being blocked by the Labour Party centrally and not allowed to be put on a ballot before members. And this is not really the kind of pluralistic democratic party that Labour should be and claims to be. This also goes against what Keir Starmer promised in 2020 when he was running to be Labour leader, in that he said he'd make these elections more democratic and that it was local parties who should choose. And yet time after time we've seen left candidates blocked on completely spurious grounds. One for liking a tweet by a Green MP, one for liking a tweet by the First Minister of Scotland when she said she had a negative COVID test. Really sort of trumped up charges, and the same scrutiny isn't being put on candidates who are perceived to be more on the right of the party. What? So that was the only reason that one person got rejected was because they liked it? It was certainly given as one of the reasons. I think one of the reasons. So there could have been other things. There were. So one of the others, and this person, as it happens, Lauren Townsend in Milton Keynes, has spoken about this herself. So I'll talk about that. She also tweeted something critical of Keir Starmer, disagreeing with him on a policy issue, which of course is fine. Lots of Labour MPs disagree with Keir Starmer on various policy issues. Many of Jenny's colleagues were briefing the press on Sunday in the House of Lords that they didn't want the House of Lords to be abolished, and they thought Keir Starmer was wrong on that. So, we've always welcomed debate within the Labour Party, and what we seem to be having now is a closing down of that debate, especially if it's from people on the left. Does this really matter to British democracy, or is this just an internal Labour issue? I think it really does matter to British democracy, because actually you don't get the best candidates if they haven't been subject to the most rigorous process. And actually local people know who is good and who is bad. The best test of who's a good candidate, who's got some skeletons in their closet, is letting local members choose who they want to represent them. They're going to pick the best candidate to win that election. You know, I've voted for people on different wings of the party over the years as a Labour Party member, not just along kind of factional lines or whatever else. It's really important that actually Labour Party gets the best candidates possible in order to scrutinise legislation in the future. And there are some really talented people on the left who unfortunately have been cut out during this process, and it's done Labour damage. You know, we've seen in Stroud, for example, is another one where the leader of the council, the Labour leader of the council, was blocked from standing, saying she wasn't, didn't pass due diligence. This is somebody who's been leading a Labour council with a far more responsibility and powers than a backbench MP would have. And yet they're told they're not fit enough to be an MP. What does that tell the local electors who have, elected this person several times and elected a Labour council? It's ridiculous.
OK, Jenny, you were a political secretary. I can't remember what the job title was for when you worked with Keir Starmer.
Political secretary.
Yeah, so this was totally in your wheelhouse. This thing that's happening now, is that a Starmer-directed process?
It's not Starmer-directed, but Keir Starmer is a strong leader. Compare him to Rishi Sunak, who's wobbling all over the shop and got called blancmange yesterday. Actually, Keir is
a killer jibe, but anyway.
Well, it's quite apt, I think. But Keir is a strong leader, and he does want the very best candidates to represent the Labour Party and their communities at the next general election. And I make absolutely no apologies for it. With the, best will in the world with Andrew, we tried it his way between 2015 and 2019, and look what happened. Absolute disaster. So, yes, Keir is, there is more grip on this process. Yes, there is. And I think you're seeing some really strong candidates coming through. And I think the next Parliamentary Labour Party is going to be an incredibly strong group of people because there is this rigour to the process. I'm very proud of it. I think it's good. Okay. And, I think this is a serious process. And you've got to have these kind of this rigorous approach to it. Letting it go on the way that happened previously, it was just catastrophic.
Let's put that to Andrew. Is this a more ruthless Keir Starmer that you and your pals are the victim of?
Definitely is a more ruthless one. And when Jenny says there's more grip, that grip is firmly around the throat of the left. And we've seen that time and again. But if we look at Jenny Chapman when she was in charge of that, look at what happened in Hartlepool. Yeah. She picked Paul Williams on a long list of one. That was what the party had to choose from. And how did he do? He lost. He also lost having, just after he was selected from that long list of one, misogynistic tweets came out that many of Jenny's colleagues or former colleagues...
Andrew, I'm going to stop you there because this is now maybe getting a little bit too granular, even for our very well-informed viewers.
Absolutely true.
Andrew, you stop there. Jenny, very quickly.
The reason all of that happened is because Keir Starmer said that he did not want people in the Parliamentary Labour Party who'd been found to have behaved in a way that, sadly, the former candidate in that seat who was chosen under the process that Andrew is supporting.
You know what, guys, let's zoom. This is getting too much even for me.
Keir is a very strong leader, and I make no apologies for that.
Andrew, thank you very much. Jenny, thank you for trying to clear all that up. Arlene, what is the right balance between, as a leader, between ruthless and kind of nice?
Well, to try to be in the middle. I think it is important.
Which the DUP were famous for.
Which we are famous for. You're absolutely right. People stop me in the street and say that to me all the time. I think what is important is that local people feel that they have ownership of their representative. And to do that, you have to have some local input. There's no doubt about that in terms of selecting people. But you also have to have people who you can go with a slate to the country and say, this is going to be, as Jenny hopes to do, this is your new government, this is the next government. And to do that, you have to have trust in them from the leadership down. And so I understand it from both sides, but I do think there has to absolutely be local input into selecting candidates because that's what's needed.
George? Very quickly.
Purging people who do not agree with you on every particular does not make you a strong leader.
Well, that
it makes you a weak leader.
Is it a purge or just a selection?
No one is saying
He's clearly using the most ridiculous pretext to knock people off that list. And that is a sign of weakness, not a sign of strength.
No, there is a very lively...
Robin, one word answer. Are you more or less scared of Keir Starmer than you were before?
Less, and I think the problem is he's not allowing generally strong local candidates to come forward. I don't think this is a question of left or right. I've got in my constituency, I've got two brilliant local Labour councillors, either of whom I would have been seriously worried about being my contestant. Neither of them have been selected. Instead, we got a list of people from London.
Got to stop you there. We've run out of time. I'll be back with newscast after question time. See you then. Bye.